idea whatsoever of civilization and have never heard of it. And in spite of the tremendous spread of our way of life, there are large areas which have not been touched, or so lightly as to mean very little. If in a more ancient time, most of the planet consisted of comparatively primitive peoples, and the last of the great Atlantean diffusion, Posidonus, was an isolated island, separated by water from practically all other areas on Earth. Most people living in other parts of the planet would have no knowledge of it. Or if they had a knowledge, it would only be a legend. And perhaps the legend is responsible for another series of interesting beliefs. The World Mountain, Olympus, Asgard of the Nordic peoples, the whole series of the demigods who walked with men, the individuals who had apparently supreme power. Montezuma bowed down to them, and they were Spaniards in armor, and Montezuma believed from reports that these men were centaurs, half man and half horse, and was not able to understand that these men were riding horses, which the Indians knew nothing about. Here, less than 500 years ago, we have a situation in which a higher cultured civilization moved in on the primitive one and was mistaken for gods until they proved that instead of being gods, they were ravishers of the earth. So, with that type of thinking, we might also find a source for much of our religious thinking. These mysterious priests of the serpent of the city of the sun. These priests were undoubtedly wise in the mysteries of life. The ancient rites and mysteries of the Greeks and Romans and Egyptians, the secret and esoteric teachings that have descended to us from unknown antiquity, may very well have originated among the esotericists of Atlantis. There also seems to be quite a little evidence to the effect that when the great decision was made and the gods decreed that the Atlanteans had destroyed themselves and must be removed from the earth, that prophets arose among them in those last days before the end. And these prophets warned the people that they had disobeyed the gods, that they had sacrificed all that was good for selfishness, avarice, and power. And these prophets led certain groups of the Atlanteans away from Atlantis and into what is now Europe and the Near East. These peoples survived. As this migration occurred at least 12 to 15,000 years ago, we have some suspicion that many of the civilizations of the Near East, and perhaps even of the Far East, originated among these transplanted peoples who had gone away from the cause of death. It is stated in the Atlantic story that a great number of the gods of Egypt were, we'll say, refugees from Atlantis. That the gods of the Egyptians were Atlantean deities who originally, perhaps, actually and physically lived as leaders of their peoples. In any event, the idea that the world was populated, in one sense, by refugees is not unreasonable. Another story of the same type, which is found in many parts of the world, states that the Atlanteans earned their final destruction by an attempt to invade Europe. That they raised a great army and sent it against Europe and North Africa. And this great army was on the march and was in these areas, claiming them, when the Central Islands were destroyed. Therefore, these armies could not return. There was no place to go back to. And many of them settled and mingled with the peoples of these areas to form some of these wonderful and mysterious civilizations which we have no real explanation for. We have very little explanation for how racial differentiation in recent times came about. The various anthropologists and so forth have charts showing what happened. But as is the case in most of science, no one seems to know how it happened or why it happened. These things occurred. New bloodstreams came forth, mingled and mixed and intertwined, and each one brought with it part of its own culture. And these parts of ancient cultures seem to linger on, perhaps in lingual differences, in arts and crafts, in psychological structures, in habits and principles, and even to a measure in bodily form and structure. In any event, as Bacon points out, we have a challenge coming to us at the present time. And this challenge is more or less documented in terms of Atlantis, and I think this is the way Plato originally used it. You know, the story of Plato's Atlantis ends in the middle of a sentence. It was never completed. Bacon's New Atlantis ends in the middle of a sentence. It was never completed. Why? We don't seem to know. But I think that Bacon tells us about the importance of it, that the destruction of Atlantis, as left by the tables of Enoch, is this great story of the disaster of disobedience. That regardless of how we think about life or what we believe about life, it is impossible for us to go contrary to the will of heaven. Anything that goes contrary comes in the end to destruction. Plato and several others of the earlier writers also seems to fableize this particular situation. Atlantis may be the submerged self in each of us. This is an interesting possible thought from a psychological standpoint. The psyche may be that part of our nature which alone bears witness to its ancient origin. If there is a record of disobedience and penalty, that record is probably primarily descending within the structure of the human being himself. It is something hidden in his own darkness. It is something that may bring him fear. It may bring him conscience. It may warn him of the dangers of the abuse of power and energy. And if so, it may be the submerged part of man's own nature, that part which was lost because of disobedience to the gods. This may be the large, deep, all-spreading mystery of the fall of man, which has been also recorded in various ways among practically all peoples of the earth. Atlantis also seems to have a very great fascination for the psychologist and the social reformer. Is it true that a civilization existed long ago which knew what we do not know today? Is there something lost in our way of life because it disappeared under the waters of the Atlantic so far back in our story? Is it true that there were giants upon the earth in those days, mental giants, that had skills and abilities which they had derived from the studies of esoteric matters? Did black magic originate in Atlantis? It probably did, according to the Platonic discussion, because it was in Atlantis that for the first time man disobeyed the gods. And from disobedience fell the angels. The entire story of human progress, so-called, is today very largely a record of disobedience. The individual has broken the rules of life. Some people, having broken the rules of life, try to study esoteric matters, hoping to find the secrets of some strange magic of long ago.